Good evening, and welcome to this special Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University honoring the memory of Helen Rees. My name is Alice Jelen Eisenberg, and I am here to represent the board of the forum. For those of you who are not familiar with the Ford Hall Forum, this is the nation's oldest, continuously operating free public lecture series. Its mission is to promote freedom of speech through the public presentation of lectures, debates, and discussions. My most notable accomplishment as a forum board member is that I recruited Helen to the board in 2007. From that time, she became an invaluable member, and in 2012, she was elected president. One of her many achievements as board president is that she oversaw the move of the forum from Northeastern University to Suffolk University, where it officially became part of Suffolk's College of Arts and Science in January of 2014. We also want you to know that this event, like all forum events, is being recorded and will be available free to subscribers on Comcast Xfinity in the Public Affairs folder. This forum also posts in a few weeks on YouTube. Please subscribe to the forum's YouTube channel to be alerted when it posts. Unlike other forums, there will not be any questions or comments following the speakers' presentations. Rather, we cordially invite all our guests to join us after the speaking program at a reception to be held in the rotunda area of the law school outside this room. All speakers have agreed to stay and chat with the audience, as well as answer questions that you might have. We also ask that you take a moment now to please silence your cell phones. Thank you. For a program like this to be successful, it takes the work and effort of many people and friends of Helen. In particular, I want to thank Jennifer Bernardi, the talented executive director of the forum, Jack Roble, the forum's treasurer and acting president while Helen was unable to attend meetings, and Johnny Wolfson, a close friend of Helen's and someone whose suggestions for this evening were invaluable. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to invite David Shaw, the husband of Helen Rees, to begin our program.
Thank you, Alice. On behalf of Helen's family, those who are here today and those who could not be, I want to thank the organizations and individuals who have worked to make this celebration of Helen's life possible. First, I thank the Ford Hall Forum, an organization which was very important to Helen. I thank the forum's executive director, Jennifer Bernardi, whose organizational skills brought this evening together smoothly, and all the board members of the forum, especially Alice Eisenberg, who was the guiding force behind this celebration and who was Helen's friend for the entirety of her 50 years in Boston. I also thank Suffolk University, the host of the forum in recent years, and our host in this room this evening, and particularly Dean Kenneth Greenberg, who worked with Helen to bring Suffolk and the forum into the close collaboration that they enjoy today. Of course, I want to thank our moderator, Francine Achbar, and our speakers. Together, Francine and our speakers shared Helen's public life in Boston and beyond, working with her on political causes, cultural pursuits, and in her professional life as a literary agent. But without doubt, they were all Helen's good friends, too. Two more individuals that I must thank by name are Donna Carpenter and Johnny Wolfson. Donna, who was important in planning this evening, but was called away for family reasons, was Helen's partner and principal collaborator at the Helen Rees Literary Agency. Johnny was more than Helen's long-term friend. They were partners in crime. Now, I know that there are a number of people in this room tonight with a valid claim to that title, myself included. But Johnny stands out, both for intensity and endurance. And finally, I want to most deeply thank all of you for coming tonight to join in celebrating Helen's life, her accomplishments, and the joy she brought to all of us. Thank you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of this evening's celebration, Francine Achbar. Francine is very appropriate for this role because she, like Helen, has long been active in the cultural, intellectual, and political life of Boston. Francine has been an award-winning producer and programming executive at WBZ-TV. Last spring, she retired as an executive director at the new Center for Arts and Culture, Boston's leading year-round Jewish cultural presenter, where Helen was an enthusiastic board member. Francine is also a regular panelist on the popular public radio quiz show, Says You. Francine?
Thank you, David. We're here to remember Helen in her many aspects as those who knew her, worked with her, did political campaigns with her, volunteered with her, and like me, often lunched with her. I see her in the lobby of the Boston Harbor Hotel. Her hair is one of those fabulous shades of red. She's wearing a stunning designer outfit, no doubt picked out with Johnny, her friend, in black, most likely with leather on it somewhere. Helen had a Jewish soul, and after some sporadic rabbi shopping, she found a good fit on my board of the new Center for Arts and Culture, which presents arts and ideas from a Jewish perspective. Typical of Helen the Connector, she graciously engineered appearances for us by her 30-year client, Alan Dershowitz, NBC Tel Aviv bureau chief Martin Fletcher, and law professor Nancy Gertner. Whenever Helen and I would get together, she would say things like, "You're brilliant. What you're doing is so great. I want to be like you when I grow up." Anyone in this room ever hear those words? I'm so sure she meant them sincerely when she said them to each of us. That was Helen, so positive, so encouraging. She did make you think, you are brilliant, and you could do whatever she was suggesting. And then even when she had to let you down, she did it in such a gracious way that one of her aspiring writers framed her turned-down letter. In it, she said, "You're not ready yet." But it made him feel good. Here's a woman who, after 4 children and a divorce, started working in fundraising at Combined Jewish Philanthropies. As head of cultural affairs for the city of Boston, she helped to put Sarah Caldwell's Opera Company of Boston into the then crumbling Opera House. As head of the Helen Rees Agency, she launched dozens of books to the New York Times bestseller lists on topics from world affairs to business to dish about Ari Onassis. She worked with celebrities from Barry Goldwater to John Kerry, Jack and Susie Welch, Czech author and statesman Václav Havel to gangster Kevin Weeks. With her passion for opera, she actually played a supernumerary, an extra, on stage at the Metropolitan Opera in New York. In her active political life, she was, back in 2007, urging all of us to support a politician most had never heard of, Barack Obama. And of course, she managed to find her wonderful husband, David Shaw, in Alaska, of all places, through the Harvard Alumni Magazine. When you think about it, Helen's life could be a Broadway musical in the style of Auntie Mame. Someone might want to option that idea. One of Helen's great friends was Liz Shannon, wife of the late Bill Shannon, former ambassador to Ireland, who, with Helen as her agent, wrote Up in the Park and I Am of Ireland about the women's political movement in Northern Ireland. She recounted this story about a trip with Helen. My son David attended a boys' boarding school named Glenstall Abbey near Limerick, and Helen and I were there to spend Easter with him. At Mass that Sunday, where all the neighboring farm families attended, Helen announced she would attend Mass with me. She appeared at my door that morning, dressed to kill. Black leather boots that came over her knees, a black and white miniskirt short enough to barely be legal, and a fabulous fur jacket. We walked down the aisle of the church toward the front. The gasp of the farmers was audible. When it was time for communion, I got up to join the line, but whispered to Helen, "Stay here, you can't go to communion." As I was coming back down the center aisle, who did I meet heading toward the altars but Helen, smiling serenely. "You can't go," I whispered again. She kept smiling and whispered back, "No problem." And so she went up and received communion, no doubt the first Jew in history to receive communion at Glenstall Abbey. My monk friend, the abbot of Glenstall, who, by the way, knew and adored Helen, said she set a new ecumenical precedent for the abbey. That was Helen. One of the most important people in Helen's professional life, as many of you know, was Donna Carpenter LeBaron, her business partner for 30 years, all of them without a written contract. Donna estimates the books they did together spent 500 weeks on the bestseller list. Donna and Helen were among the first publishers of e-books through their company called New Word City, and Donna continues to run WordWorks. Donna lives in Switzerland and could not be with us today, but she shared this story. Many years ago, Helen and I flew to Egypt to explore the possibility of President Hosni Mubarak writing his memoirs. He declined, but the trip was eventful nonetheless. On our last night in Cairo, Osama El-Baz, one of Mubarak's senior advisors, invited us to meet a Middle East leader. Turned out to be Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi. Osama wanted us as Americans to advise Gaddafi about how to respond to U.S. pressure to surrender the bombers of Pan Am Flight 103. Helen characteristically took on the challenge. Without wavering, she told Gaddafi he would have no allies until he gave up trying to build chemical and nuclear weapons. In the end, Gaddafi did exactly that. Donna continues, Helen embraced and unleashed every aspect of her personality, and that's what made her unique and dear to all of us. She didn't allow herself to be tamed or contained. She didn't choose between being strong or soft, complex or simple. She didn't subject herself to ultimatums. She was always herself. The same woman who could make editors cringe also took time to connect with each and every one of us, friends, family, clients, even people she encountered in her rambles through Boston, making us feel loved, making us believe in ourselves. Well, we have several people whose lives Helen affected, and they're here to share their stories. The first one is Phyllis Karas, a recent pal of mine. Phyllis was a client of Helen Rees Agency for 21 years. During that time, she published 6 fiction and 4 nonfiction books, including the 2006 New York Times bestseller, Brutal, The Untold Story of My Life Inside Whitey Bulger's Irish Mob, and The Onassis Women, the memoir of Aristotle Onassis' personal secretary while he was married to Jackie Kennedy. Phyllis has been a stringer for People magazine and written for Boston Magazine, Vogue, Inside Magazine, and Moment. Phyllis is an adjunct professor at the Boston University School of Journalism. Please welcome Phyllis Karas.
Thank you so much, Francine. Helen Rees, indeed, was my agent and dear friend for 21 years. For the first project on which we worked together, the memoir of Kiki Ferruti Moutsatsis, the private secretary to Aristotle Onassis during his marriage to Jackie Kennedy, Helen made one phone call and secured me $1 million advance. To say I loved her with all my heart from that moment on would be a serious understatement. The Onassis book was a dream come true, involving 2 trips to Greece, a 3-page special in People magazine, and the thrill of a Dateline NBC special filmed at Kiki's La Perla Resort in Ia, Santorini. But all of that glamour paled by comparison to the road trip Helen and I took 3 years later to Norfolk, Mass. To be specific, to MCI Norfolk, the medium security prison which housed 150 inmates. The purpose of that trip was a result of a polite little luncheon in Helen's Washington Street office, where she served me a chicken kebab salad and introduced me to the first gangster I had ever met, Edward J. Mackenzie, who touted himself as a leg breaker for Whitey Bulger. Up until that luncheon, where I did not even take a tiny nibble of my salad, in my rarefied world, a leg breaker was an orthopedic surgeon. And I did not have the slightest idea of who this Whitey guy was. Eddie had written the beginnings of a memoir, which a friend of Helen's had asked her to consider getting published. Why Helen thought I might be the person to work with Eddie Mackenzie is a question whose answer Helen has taken with her. But in order to be sure that Eddie was as bad as he claimed and as involved with the Whitey Bulger gang as he also claimed, it was crucial that Helen and I hear about Eddie from Freddie Weichel, another Bulger intimate. Since Freddie was 27 years into a life sentence without parole for a murder he was the first to tell you he had not committed, it was impossible for him to come to Helen's office for a chicken kebab salad. Thus, the dynamic duo was heading to Freddie's residence, a true gated community, to check out Eddie Mackenzie's veracity. The absurdity of such a visit was obviously lost on me, as Helen and I discussed a far more important aspect of the visit. What on earth does one wear to visiting day in jail? As always, in matter of wardrobe, I conceded to Helen, and thus we drove from Boston to Norfolk in unobtrusive cashmere black sweaters, simple black wool pants, unadorned black leather boots, carrying refined but small shoulder strap handbags, and wearing gold earrings and single-strand pearls. Nothing flashy for the two of us. I picked up Helen, armed with bags of bagels, apples, and chocolate bars to satisfy her omnipresent sweet tooth, and off we drove, me at the wheel of my SUV, Helen going over the questions we would ask our new friend. Where did you first meet Eddie Mackenzie? How well did you know Whitey Bulger? Do you have any Bulger stories to add to Eddie's book? Tell me a little about your specialty in crime. Since Freddie was not allowed visitors with journalistic privileges, we could not bring in a pen and paper. He would have to memorize all the questions and answers, something we were certain the two of us could handle. Our arrival at the prison, however, was off to a most inauspicious start. Not only was the prison officer we met upon check-in immune to Helen's charms, but the fact that she did not have any photo identification in her stunning little black bag, was literally a killer. No matter how charmingly she showed the gruff beyond words officer all her charges, Neiman Marcus, Saks, Barney's, etc., he remained strongly and singularly unimpressed. The fact that she had lost her license months earlier unimpressed him even more. No photo ID, no entrance. Thus, 30 minutes after we arrived at the prison, I was being led through a maze of iron gates, sans my black bag, black boots, simple earrings, and single strand of pearls, which lay sadly in a locker in the first floor waiting room that we had entered, while Helen, sans license, was driving my SUV to a meeting spot 45 minutes away where the ever-wonderful David would meet her with her passport in hand. Only 45 minutes of the 3-hour visit remained when Helen, miraculously still wearing her jewelry, another question with whose answer she has escaped this world, appeared in the visiting room. And Freddie, who had seemed more than bored with my presence and had sent me to the vending machine 4 times to secure food and check out my black pants and black sweater in walking mode, suddenly came to life. Helen rattled off question after question, and Eddie responded animatedly. And, as we sadly learned many years later, dishonestly as well. But that was not our concern of the day. Our concern was looking well in the visiting room without appearing to be out of place. Oh yeah, good chance of that happening for the two of us. On our way home, Helen could not have been more delighted. There is a good book here, she insisted, and you will write it, and we will open up a whole new world for you, and it will be good for you. And I did. And it was. The visit to Eddie, alas, was just the beginning for Helen and me in our new role as gangster intimates, followed by visits to the streets of Southie, where victims of Eddie Mackenzie may or may not have recovered from their falls, to marshes where bodies were definitely buried, but not by Eddie Mackenzie, and a whole host of new acquaintances and guests for Helen's New Year's Eve parties. And the final publication of Street Soldier, after problems with HarperCollins that I surely do not have the time or the heart to describe. The fact that Eddie is now in jail himself, finally having found his just punishment for years of lying and scamming the Swedenborgian Church of millions of dollars, should be the proper ending for this escapade. But my final memory of that Mackenzie project will always be the look on Freddie Weichel's face when Helen walked into that waiting room. In one quick glance, he understood that here was a woman who could, if she wanted, change his life. The same feeling I had the first time I met her, and only that first time I met the one and only extraordinary Helen Rees. Life is a lot duller and more ordinary without Helen, but I will never stop being grateful for the 21 years during which she lit up my life. And I am certain as I always was, that Helen would not let me stop rewriting until the proposal I prepared was as perfect as humanly possible. That wherever Helen is now, she is working her magic, finding people the stories that need to be written and writers that will write them. Somehow she will get her messages back to Boston, and these books will come into being. Personally, I've already received a few of those messages. And believe me, Helen, I'm on it. How could I ever not be? Thank you.
And here she is, staring at us just as we knew her. Larry Kirshbaum has been associated with all sides of publishing over a span of 50 years. He's been a journalist at Newsweek, an author of a book on student protest, and for most of his career, the CEO and publisher of the Time Warner Book Group, now the Hachette Book Group, where he got to work with Helen Rees and some of her fabulous authors. Please welcome Larry Kirshbaum.
Thank you, Francine, and good evening, everybody. I want to thank Jennifer Bernardi, as others have already thanked her, and also Donna Carpenter, who unfortunately can't be with us. The two of them have really been instrumental in getting me here from New York in this great tribute to Helen. This afternoon, I had a wonderful day. It was a picture-perfect day, as I think you all know, after what has been, for you, even a worse winter than the one in New York. And I sat out in the Commons and thanked Helen for giving us this day in her honor, and at the same time, of course, for having been such an amazing force in our lives over many, many years. We live in very querulous times today, where compromise has become kind of a dirty word, and the activists seem to move more and more to the extremities of the body politic. I say this because Helen Rees, in my view, was a throwback to the idea that collaboration can work. And she practiced this idea with great success. In her role as literary agent, she always realized that author and publisher would wind up on the same side of the table, ultimately, as the book went through the publishing process. And thus the dynamic of negotiation was to arrive at a place where both parties felt good about moving forward together. I first met Helen in the mid-'80s when she was representing a Nobel Physics laureate named Sheldon Glashow. I had read that Shelley was teaching a class at Harvard called Physics for Poets. And since I was an English major who was struggling with both physics and poetry, I decided that this could be a subject of great interest to a broader audience. Now, being a bit audacious in those days as the head of the Time Warner Book Group, I wrote Shelley a letter offering him the opportunity to be the nude centerfold in a calendar of science luminaries. This is true. The next thing I knew, I was flying up to Boston, where Helen picked me up at Logan, and we then had a long, delightful dinner where, like everyone else who ever met Helen, I fell totally in love. We spent hours gossiping about the state of publishing, on which she was an amazing expert, having seen the overview here from Boston, and at the same time swapping personal stories. Finally, when our coffee had long gone cold, we got around to discussing what we were supposedly there to do, which was a deal. Well, naturally, I had forgotten to bring any paper. There was, of course, no laptops in those days, nor did I have a pen, and neither did she. So we had to literally borrow a pencil. I remember this stubby pencil that could barely, it was a blur of letters. And we borrowed a napkin. We used a napkin, literally a napkin that somewhat soiled already, as I recall. And in about 10 minutes, we worked out the deal, and Shelley blessed it the next day. But it taught me a very, very good lesson, which was when you dealt with Helen, the legalities really didn't matter all that much. It was her word, and it was as good as any contract. And more importantly, in dealing with Helen, the publishing process, which can frequently get to be adversarial, unfortunately, with Helen, it was a joy. She always found a way to work things out, and she always said to me and to others, publishers that she dealt with, don't worry, we're going to work it out. Now, I parenthetically learned later that what that meant is we're going to work it out the way I want to work it out. But, in Helen's hands, it was like she would say, listen, life is so much more important than this deal, as she stole, subclause C from you. But that was Helen. Great charm, but also great intelligence, and in the end, great fun as well. I started calling her the pickle, and I'm not actually sure why. We were probably in a deli at the time when this suddenly came to me, and it seemed appropriate that here was a woman who could be, if you look at this punum, as my grandmother would say, who could be sweet, she could be a little tart, but she was always herself. You always knew what you were going to get with Helen Rees, and somehow this word came into my mind, the pick, and thereafter I always referred to her, and she always referred to me. She started calling me the pickle too. I don't know why, but we did. One of my greatest mistakes occurred with Helen. In the early 90s, we signed up a very provocative business book called Re-Engineering the Corporation, which was written by Michael Hammer and James Champy. It was a manifesto for business process re-engineering, as the title suggests, which it turned out was a burgeoning field in the business world. The book was brilliantly written by Donna Carpenter, who's been mentioned several times already, and it was heralded by Forbes magazine as one of the 3 best business books of the last 20 years. It spent over a year on the New York Times bestseller list. It was all perfect, but unfortunately for me, for some ridiculous reason that I have now totally repressed, we canceled the book prior to publication, and it was thereafter published by HarperCollins to incredible acclaim and success. And every week that it sat on the New York Times bestseller list, my mother, this is a good Freudian one, my wife would turn to me and say, there you go again, Lair, another week on the New York Times list, and you turned it down. But to her credit, Helen was, while very shocked and quite perturbed at the time that I canceled, never really let our friendship waver, and she never gloated. I guess she didn't have to over my stupidity. It was so self-evident. But we went on and made the right call in publishing Alan Dershowitz, for example, a book called America on Trial. And working with Alan and Helen was quite a trip. For those of you who know both of them, it was kind of like watching tag team wrestling. They would literally finish each other's sentences. And of course, as we know, Alan was never a quiet, self-flagellating individual, shall we say. Alan had a pretty healthy ego. I'm sorry he's not here. I would still say this to him. But Helen knew how to handle him. She was quite brilliant at it. And of course, working with the two of them was really, for me, a great thrill, because they were both stars in their own world, and watching them together was worth the price of admission. It was one of the great publishing experiences for me. And I am sorry that Alan couldn't be here tonight, but I certainly enjoyed immensely working with him in that capacious mind. In the end, I'm very sorry to think that Helen, the pick, has gone elsewhere. And I agree with what we've heard earlier, that she's probably arranging other authors and so on, and maybe given her Christian moment doing it for St. Peter. We really don't know, do we? But her lecture and her books will continue to live on and be great successes, and she will certainly live on in our hearts. Thank you.
I don't want to rub it in, but Michael Hammer was a much beloved friend, board member of the New Center for Arts and Culture. No offense. Helen's friend Joan Lukey has been a top business litigator at Boston's prestigious law firms, Wilmer Hale, Ropes and Gray, and currently Choate, Hall and Stewart. She served twice as Massachusetts Special Assistant Attorney General and is a past president of the American College of Trial Lawyers. Helen didn't have any friends who were slouches. Joan was the first person ever to hold that position. I think, among other points, she and Helen connected through politics. Joan Lukey.
Thank you so much. Let me say that there are many of you in this room who've known Helen longer than I have. And I realize that speaking to some of you ahead of time, because I only knew Helen as a redhead. I missed all the other shades. Nonetheless, it's been 12 years, 12 wonderful years of friendship. And I'm going to take you back in time to 2003. Now, it doesn't seem as if 12 years is that long ago, but that was 2 years after 9/11. We were a country still in mourning. It was a difficult time. And Helen and I, predictably enough, given her penchant for politics, met on a political campaign. John Kerry had just launched his presidential campaign, and he had asked me to serve as the vice chair of his New England Finance Committee because we had been friends since law school, not because I was well known as a great political fundraiser. Now, I am not a person who is particularly self-deprecating myself. I don't think most of the people who are friends with Helen are. Helen was a big personality, and most of us around her had some element of that bigness about either our personalities or our egos as well. Nonetheless, walking into the first Finance Committee meeting, which was a large group, probably 35 or 40 people, at another large Boston law firm, Mintz-Levin, I walked in, vice chair to the chair, wonderful Alan Solomon, Ambassador Solomon, fabulous man. We were seated at the head of the table each time, and the table went out in a U shape around us, and I looked out, and it was about 95% men. Now, those who were closer to my own age and to Helen's age were fine. There were a lot of young Turks there who really fit Tom Wolfe's Masters of the Universe mindset. And in stage whispers were complaining about why I would be up there at the front of the table when they clearly would do a better job raising money. Even I was a little disconcerted by that. But in that room that day, among the handful of women were beautiful redheaded Helen Rees and lovely Alice Jelen Eisenberg. When it was over, Alice and Helen approached me, and Helen kind of pulled me or maneuvered me, I wasn't quite sure what was happening, over to the side and said to me, "Fabulous, just fabulous." Now, I had not said one word in that meeting because Alan was establishing the rules and whatnot, and it was his committee. I was there to assist him. I kind of looked at her like, what is this wonderful person who's 6 inches taller than I am saying? And then she said, "The outfit was perfect. These men needed to see red." But thereafter, I must say, Helen and Alice were both wonderful in their encouragement. I actually was very taken aback to hear Francine's comments that Helen told other people that they were brilliant and wonderful. And I thought, my God, she gave me the courage to get past those masters of the universe by convincing me I was brilliant, wonderful, and capable. And without her support and Alice's, it would have been a much harder road to hoe. They were wonderful. Thank you, Alice. Helen was amazing. Now, in 2008, we were with different candidates, but I'm going to take us out of politics for a minute, even though that was what I was asked to focus on, and talk about the year 2006, when Helen decided that I should go to Paris with her. It was the most fabulous, funny trip I have ever taken, and I travel a lot. We were only going for 5 days. One of her clients had offered her the use of his small apartment in Paris. The date was settled so late that I think I paid something like $3,000 to get a round-trip coach ticket, but it was well worth it to have the time to spend. Never mind Paris, and Paris is fine, but it's not my favorite city. But that time with Helen all to myself was the most fun that I could possibly imagine. And I'll give you just a few little examples. Helen really dressed the part for Paris. I mean, to tell you, she was in like flowing capes and other outfits I had never seen her in. And it totally worked because the French, including the French men, which with all due respect, we don't get much here, they had an eye for fashion and for beauty. And Helen was a beautiful woman. The other thing about European men, which I've always appreciated, is that they still consider beautiful women beautiful when they're past 40 or 50 or even 60. In fact, I think Helen was pushing up on 70, and she was drop-dead gorgeous. She would walk down the street carrying her head so high and wearing like high-heeled boots, and I would be in my flats and shorter than she was anyway, feeling like I must look like I'm her assistant or something. And she would walk by, and I could not help but notice that every head turned, which was really fabulous to see. Because I loved the fact that there was an appreciation of this spirit and this natural beauty that didn't have to be a 25 or 30-year-old stick model. She looked great. In the shade of red she was wearing, and her hair then was really bright and really beautiful. My favorite part, though, about that trip was this. As we were going over, I said, "I don't speak French. Do you?" And she said, "Un petit peu." And I said, "Okay, good enough. She's going to be able to speak French." We get there, and we go to the first sidewalk cafe, and the waiter starts to speak to us in French, because she could pass for continental easily. I don't think I could. I don't think I had spikes yet. Well, yeah, I did have spikes, spiky hair. But anyway, she could pass. She decides to respond to him by speaking, which she did the rest of the time we were there, speaking English with a French accent. Now, I said, "You know what, Helen? You realize that's the worst of all worlds, because not only are you not speaking in French, but they think that you can speak French and aren't." But nobody was offended by it. The waiters all loved her. They hovered around. They did whatever she wanted. She spent the entire time speaking English with a French accent, and it was a perfect French accent. And the other thing that she did on that trip was take me shopping repeatedly, at the end of which time I realized that I had spent a fortune and bought several outfits, and she hadn't. The other thing about it was that she had talked me into outfits, as I said to a couple of folks beforehand here, that are still hanging in my closet unworn. I got home, I put one on, and my husband said, "What is that?" And I said, "Well, it's whoever the designer is. Helen said I should get it." And he said, "It would probably look great on Helen." But I was so short, it looked like a flapper outfit on me. Hence, it never got out of the closet. But there's no question that it will remain in that closet forever because I will never part with it now. Last fall, my husband and I decided to buy a condo in the city to live in during the week to be closer to my law firm because the hours are long. And I gravitated toward the waterfront because of Helen and David being at Harbor Towers. We bought in November. We didn't get in until December. And I never got to see Helen either in her own apartment or in mine thereafter. The last time I saw her was her birthday party. But Helen was the kind of person who didn't want to burden her friends. And I am stunned in retrospect that I didn't figure something out sooner. I would repeatedly email or call and say, "We want you to come over," even though we still had the rental furniture. In fact, thanks to our decorator, we still have the rental furniture, but that's a different story. And first it was a cold, and then it was the flu, and then they needed to be away. And I actually was saying to meanwhile she's responding to questions like, can you recommend a housekeeper, know anybody who has a dog walker, what kind of vacuum does the housekeeper like, because I got her housekeeper to come to us. All these things she responded to, never told me what was wrong, and I had finally sent one probably in January or February saying, "Helen, what is going on? We have to get together. I need to see you. I need to know what's going on." And she said, "I picked up a little infection. It will be fine in the spring." I didn't really believe her at that point, but I mentioned it to my husband in front of the housekeeper, who was a very discreet and sweet and wonderful woman. And she said to me, "Mrs. Joan, Mrs. Helen is not well at all." And that was the first I knew that Helen was very ill. I wasn't angry at all, of course, that she hadn't told me. I, in fact, admire the spirit of a person like Helen, who could know what she was going through and be talking to a friend whom I believe she loved as much as I loved her, and just not want to put the burden on the friend. I guess there is a part of me that will always be glad that the last opportunity to see her, even though she was ill by then, but it wasn't showing, was at such a happy occasion as what I believe she referred to as a form of anniversary party rather than birthday party, not wanting to acknowledge the passing of years. It was wonderful. It was a great way to have fabulous memories of a fabulous woman, and it was a great opportunity to see one of the most amazing partnerships I've ever seen, that of Helen and David. Thank you, David, for all that you did for Helen. Thank you for being the support for her in all those difficult last months. And thank you for sharing her with us, her friends, for all those many years. Nobody in this room will ever, ever forget Helen Rees. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. Helen Rees was Michael Tracy's introduction to the world of publishing. When Michael's first book, The Discipline of Market Leaders, was published in 1995, Helen brought together a business consultant who knew nothing about publishing and a publisher who knew nothing about business books. It was Helen's way, as was Helen's way, she had brokered the perfect marriage. The Discipline of Market Leaders went on to have a long run on the New York Times bestseller list and appeared in 14 languages in 31 countries. Please welcome Michael Tracy for some reflections on what it meant to have Helen Rees in your corner.
Thank you very much, appreciate it. Sitting here and listening to everybody, I must say it's clear what a character Helen was, right? The woman had style, she was forthright, you knew where you stood with Helen. And the most important thing is she had a presence, that in a room, she seemed to be a delicate, tall woman who took up a lot of space, who had a real presence wherever she was. What I'd like to reflect on is something different than what a character she was, and it is, I'd like to reflect on why, despite having really met with her very few times over the 20, 25 years that I knew her, perhaps 24 times, we were ever in the same room. I considered her truly a friend, okay? You know, as you get older, one of the sobering realizations you have is that you have this vast network of people you've called friends, most of whom really only qualify as acquaintances. You know, they're people you know and they're people you like and you spend some time with them. But they're not friends by a definition I use, which is a very simple one. And that is that if I have an issue and I have a need, will that person be unconditionally there for me? Without question about why I need help or whether the help I need is worthy or not. Will that person be there? And it's funny, for me, friendship is not about how much time you spend with people. I spend lots of time with folks who are my acquaintances, but I know deep down they're not there. I'm outside the circle. The thing about Helen that I think is extraordinary is not that I considered her a friend by my definition, but that so many people did. That she was, in fact, in your corner. She was all in if you needed help. And it showed itself in just a lot of different ways, So to me, that was what bonded me with Helen over a 2-decade period, even though, as I say, we probably saw each other once a year, and half of those were business meetings in the 90s, and the other half were social, maybe every other year. The other thing about Helen that made her a friend is someone who makes you feel better about yourself. A friend is someone who accentuates what's good and positive and worthy about you. You don't leave a friend feeling worse about yourself. And look at this fabulous, this fantastic all the rest. I mean, my God, we have 2 sons here, though, who sadly are coming to the realization tonight that each of them was told they were her favorite, probably, right? But you know, she made everyone feel better about themselves, and it was honest. Like, she looked for the positive in you, and that's what bonded her to you, and that's what excited her about someone. I have enough flaws to fill this room that she could have talked about, or God knows if we'd ever got on politics, that might have been the end of it, because I'm clearly from a different stripe than Helen was, but it never came up. Because she just focused on the things that she thought were fabulous about each one of us. The third thing about a friend is a friend sort of opens doors either practically or intellectually or spiritually, but they allow you, they help you to fulfill your own dreams. And I saw that so clearly in Helen. She took me, who truly knew nothing about publishing, and yet I was very headstrong, and gave me just enough insight to proceed, and then put all sorts of folks in front of me who could help me be successful, whether it was with the book itself or with other aspects of my professional life. And she was always out there trying to figure out how she could help you get to where you wanted to go. And a lot of my conversations with Helen were about that. They were about, what do you want to do? You know, where are you heading with things? The last thing, and this may be the Jewish mother in Helen, is she was a tremendous matchmaker, right? She understood enough about people to know who would work and who wouldn't together. So it's actually true. The publisher she picked for me, and she picked the publisher, was Addison Wesley. They'd never done a business book in their lives. And she picked them because she knew I was so headstrong about how to market a book, even though I'd never published one, that I would instantly come into conflict with anyone who actually had marketed a business book in the past. Instantly, right? And bless his soul, David Gearing couldn't have been a better supporter and just enabled whatever we wanted to go do, and we did a lot of crazy things that had never been done before, and it worked really, really well. But for me, you know, it's worth all of us reflecting on this. Who are your real friends? Who are the people that are there for you unconditionally? Who are the people that make you feel better about yourself? Who are the people that open things up and create possibilities and help you to enable your own dreams? And who is it that is generous with their own friends and networks and makes them available to you to help your life be a better life? And that's why I'm here tonight, because I think Helen was truly a great friend to many, many people here in this room. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Ross Terrell of Harvard's Fairbanks Center for East Asian Research moves within the triangle of academia, journalistic writing, and public life. He's written 10 books and won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and the National Magazine Award. His recent titles include Madame Mao, The Australians, China in Our Time, and The New Chinese Empire. Ross connected with Helen through publishing and PEN New England.
Thank you, Francine. Helen brought excitement to the literary world. She was not my agent when we met 35 years ago. I already had an agent, Barbara Lowenstein, whom I still have. But Helen, from the beginning, became my confidant, my invaluable confidant in all my endeavours through the 1980s and the 1990s. At the writers' organisation PEN New England, when I was then on the board, Helen made contact as a newly minted literary agent, and excitement was not a prominent trait in PEN New England. Helen ruffled a few feathers. There were founders who valued their turf and who were set in their ways. And I learnt that Helen was not staid. She was not satisfied with what existed. She was always looking to the horizon for something better. I saw Helen's courage. It wasn't very common in the early 1980s to set up a literary agency from Boston. I find an entry in my diary for January 2, 1985. Dinner with Helen Rees at Copley's. She spoke about the setting up of her literary agency. The slow first years, she said, she made about $6,000 a year. Then last year, she made $60,000. Not a bad improvement after only 4 years. Helen was not boasting. She was simply taking pleasure in the process that she had boldly undertaken. She was happy, and with Helen, happiness was infectious, and it made me feel happy for her too. She was also generous, and I and many other authors, even those she didn't represent, benefited from her generosity. So did my agent. In the 1980s, William Morrow had published my book on Madame Mao, but I wanted to write my next book on Australia, my native land, and Helen and I discussed this, and she stimulated me in my project. And she had just had, I think, 1 or 2 successes with Fred Hills, an editor at Simon & Schuster. And Helen told Fred Hills about me and my interest in a book on Australia. 3 months later, Barbara, my agent, had signed a contract with Fred Hills for a book which became The Australians in 1987. I thought Helen would claim to be a co-agent for this book, but she made no such claim, and it was an extraordinary piece of generosity on her part. Much later, from the late 90s, Helen saw clouds over publishing, and she was more candid to me about them than my own agent Barbara. In some ways, I think there was a golden age of book publishing in a period that was also the period of Helen Rees. She was part of it, she contributed to it. Alas, the golden wave of the 80s and the 90s, mainly, like Helen's ebullient career, was not to be eternal. But Helen's spirit we have, and it has been beautifully adduced here tonight. It's a spirit she passes on to her family, her authors, and many more of us who were a sort of extended literary family. Her passion for living, her engagement in the present moment, and her capacity to then engage in the next successive moment. Enjoy the process, Ross, she would say to me if I was stressed out. Look into the faces of those new people you complain about having to meet, and you'll find richness in the encounter. And she had a great talent that has been mentioned already for making connections. Connections between people and connections between topics that she thought should be connected. Once in New York, she took me to the Met to hear the Chinese basso Tianhaojiang, and a few days later, I found myself in Tien's apartment. Helen had the idea that I would co-write the memoirs of Mr. Tien. Well, I wasn't a natural co-writer, and From Mao to the Met, as the book was called, From Mao to the Met came out with a very capable co-writer. It wouldn't have come out at all for Helen, and she spent time trying to get me, and no doubt others. It didn't work out for her. And I was very touched in March when Mr. Tien, now a very prominent singer at the Met, he came up to Boston for the service for Helen, he and his wife. Politics has been mentioned, and I met Michael Dukakis and John Kerry first in Helen's house in Commonwealth Ave. I didn't share her political views, but in my experience, for Helen, real friendship was not impaired at all by political differences, as Michael has also suggested. Passionate as her political convictions were, she did not impose them on those who may differ. In India and other Asian countries, there's a tree called the banyan tree. Scores of branches, rich with leaves. Birds from all over cluster within the welcoming branches of the banyan tree. It offers a guaranteed support, shelter, shade, rest for the feathered friends. We were fortunate birds lighting on Helen's many branches. Helen Rees was one of Boston's great banyan trees. She was one of the literary world's great banyan trees. Thank you.
What a beautiful analogy. Well, we're all lucky to, those of us who know and those of us who are getting to know each other who were friends of Helen. One of her other friends is Dorothy Terrell, who rose through the ranks of Digital Equipment Corporation and in less than 10 years was the company's first African-American woman plant manager. She was president of Sun Microsystems Sun Express and a corporate officer. Later, her positions included senior vice president of worldwide sales for NMS Communications, president of Platform Services Group, and president and CEO of the Initiative for a Competitive Inner City. Dorothy was another one who got to know Helen, or connected with Helen through politics.
Thank you, Francine. Good evening. As Francine said, my name is Dorothy Terrell, and I was honored to call Helen Rees my friend. Helen and I met during the early days of then Senator Barack Obama's campaign for the White House. We were both members of what was known as the New England Steering Committee, and I see a few other familiar faces from that committee in this room also. It was as if our eyes met across the room, and as some others have said, it was love at first sight. We became extremely close, co-conspirators even, and co-believers that we had to do everything we could, including giving all we could, and when we thought that we had hit the limit. We found that there were other ways to contribute, and we did that also. We begged everyone we could for money for the campaign until we laughed that people would cross the street when we came. And some of you in this room were probably in that category also. And we ventured out to other states to help when possible. We didn't make too many moves, including writing bigger checks without checking with each other, wondering if we should, but we always did. And me following Helen's lead, we always actively supported each other and the others in the committee. While I was in California, attending a Black Corporate Directors Conference where Valerie Jarrett was the featured speaker, I was wondering if it would be a good idea to bring Valerie to Massachusetts for a fundraiser. Even before approaching Valerie, I called Helen, who of course thought it was a brilliant idea. We spoke briefly about what success might look like, but with Helen's support, I approached Valerie and the rest was history. A great many people made that one of the committee's most successful fundraisers of the campaign. But it may not have happened if Helen hadn't thought it possible, even brilliant. It was like that with Helen. She was always encouraging, made me feel that everything was possible, and that I was never alone. We talked constantly about the first campaign being a must-win for the then Senator Barack Obama, who deserved to be President Barack Obama, and the first African-American president, and that Michelle Obama would be a fabulous and stylish First Lady, and that they and their daughters would do the White House, America, and the world proud. We followed every beat of that campaign and the results of that history. We were still worn out by the next campaign, but we knew that that one was about the Supreme Court, and so we started writing checks again. To know Helen is to know that she was about family and friends. I met her beloved David on a number of occasions, but I believe that I may have met her other members of the family, the sons, the children, the spouses, grandchildren, maybe only once or twice. But it didn't matter. It was as if I knew them intimately. Helen was so proud of her family and talked about them all the time. I'm sure no deep family secrets were divulged, but I knew the highlights of what was going on with everybody. She loved her children and their children and was thrilled, even over the moon even, when she could go shopping with her granddaughter. She was sure she would take after her and would have an appreciation for the art of shopping, that is. And we all know that Helen had an eye for shopping, as mentioned earlier. We both loved black, and that's mostly what we wore, particularly Helen. Only Helen was the more stylish one. I would always comment on how much I admired a particular item that she was wearing, and she would always brush it off with the compliment, with something like, oh, this old thing. And then she'd launch into the glory days of shopping at Filene's basement. I can really enjoy being casual, but when Helen and I were getting together, I wanted to make sure that I could hang, and she encouraged me to step up my game for sure. I returned Monday to Boston and went to the new Roach Brothers supermarket, which is in the old Filene's basement, and immediately thought of Helen and wondered what would she think of the new development. And it's not the same by any stretch of the imagination, but I thought she'd be pleased. Helen was a great friend, and she had quite a few, as you've heard tonight. Over time, I may not have met many, but I felt I knew them all. Once she decided to bring several of her girlfriends together for dinner so that we could each meet each other. None of us felt like strangers to the others since Helen had talked about each one of us to the other. It felt more like a gathering of old friends. The dinner was at Helen and David's apartment, and to make the evening perfect, David was our chef. Of course, it was a fabulous evening, and we had a fabulous meal, just as Helen predicted. I could only say that about the many authors that Helen had, I may have met one or two, but I felt like I knew them just like I knew the family or her friends through Helen's enthusiastic talking about them. My late husband, Albert, agreed with me that Helen was fabulous and he loved talking with her. They actually flirted a lot. When Al was really ill, Helen checked in regularly. When he was too ill to really enjoy going out, a mutual friend had what became Al's last dinner party. It was at our apartment. She prepared and brought what she lovingly called a meal on wheels. And the evening included Cheryl Marshall and her husband Howard, who did the cooking, Albert and me, and Helen and David. It was a special evening with special people, and I will always remember it for the people and for the evening and what it meant to my husband. Helen and I didn't see each other much after I moved to Miami, but when we did, we talked about everything. I loved talking to her because we both loved to discuss events and share information, and Helen was a wealth of knowledge. We could get together whenever we could, and it wasn't too much, but as time passed, one of us, and most often it was Helen, would write and ask the question, how can the world go on if we don't see each other soon? Sometimes we would meet for only an hour, but we could cover a lot of territory in that time. We talked about everything under the sun, and nothing was off limits. We both loved to travel and talked about where we had been, where we were going, and always about when we'd get together again. Helen helped me appreciate opera, another art that she loved. As many of you know, she traveled to see opera in and outside of the US, and it was usually playing in the apartment whenever I was there. Helen loved books, and the subject matter varied. And you could say, duh, that was her business, but she truly loved to read and was an avid reader and loved to share books she thought I might like or I should like. Helen loved history and current events, and we could talk about it all. I always felt our conversations added something to my imagination, my mind. It was always stimulating. Of course, I saw Helen with others, and I know that she made everyone feel special. But that didn't make me feel less special. Helen was a force. We are all better people for having known her, and she will be missed. I miss her. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. Our last speaker is Larry Moulter. Larry knew Helen the longest, I think, of all these speakers. They worked in the Kevin White administration in the 1970s, and more recently, they did books together. Larry is executive in residence at the Center for Collaborative Leadership at UMass Boston. As chairman and CEO of the New Boston Garden Corporation, Larry led the development of a new Boston garden, the first person to do so in 68 years. He also led Boston Coach through the depths of the recent recession. He is currently the chairman of the board of the Campus Agency, a college marketing company. Larry.
David, Alice, Francine, thank you for putting us all together this evening. Wasn't easy. I'm sure with the lives we live, none of this was easy to put people together, but it's greatly, greatly appreciated. I was asked by David to try to wrap this up. I don't know how you do it after Phyllis, after Larry, after Joan, Mike, Ross, and Dorothy. I don't know what's left to say, but I will attempt to say something that puts the thread through the life of a person I've known for a long, long time. A few weeks ago, my wife and I had the opportunity at Trinity Church to hear the St. Paul's Cathedral Choir. And Helen, I'm sorry, it wasn't an opera, but it was a choir that had been in existence for 900 years that performed wonderfully in a very special place in Boston. Among the choral pieces they performed was one that caught my attention, and was called "Grief is the Price for Love." So grief may have been tonight's price of admission, but it is our love for Helen that brought us together in this moment and in this place. Like so many of us, Helen lived a life abundant with change and challenges. Many here first met her during what might be called her activist period, whether it was agitating for peace in Brookline or setting the cultural agenda for the city. Helen believed, and as we all know, she believed ferociously, in peace and in politics. In the Kevin White City Hall, it was an administration populated by some strong male personalities, people like Barney Frank, Peter Mead, Ira Jackson, Kirk O'Donnell. But Helen, she held her own every day in there. For those who were familiar with Kevin White's style, there was always a number of back and forths in progress, and skirmishes were always encouraged. Actually, a well-known secret from those days, Kevin White loved conflict. But in this world, Helen held her ground. As a colleague of hers said, she was a force. Having seen this force in action during those Kevin White years, you might have said that Helen had a fierce intensity about her, but you would also have to say that she had a well-thought-out and deeply developed sense of integrity. And even though, through her activist years, you might have characterized her rather kindly as self-confident, you also had to admire that she remained a humble soul. Eventually, her City Hall days ended, largely because the big boys of that era still hadn't quite learned how to accept a smart woman with big ideas. So when she set out for a new challenge, we knew that she wasn't being reckless. How could you with 4 sons trailing behind you? But rather, she had a vision and a purpose to remake Boston into a more contemporary center of the literary world, a city where ideas and the business of ideas would not be easily ceded to New York City. There was never a doubt that she could play the role of the big New York agent, at least never a doubt in her mind, but there were a number of doubters here in the city when she launched her agency. In many ways, she believed in the brand of Boston well before we ever thought of Boston as a brand. In many respects, she disrupted the axis of literary power, tilting it a bit more towards Boston, thus giving rise to agents and authors who now could proclaim to be of Boston. I think that one of the many characteristics we appreciated in Helen was that she didn't let middle age, however we defined it then or now, dull her passion or her activism. She learned how to make her activist side coexist with the new business side. Even though Helen, like so many of us, had grown into a cloud of disillusionment with the world around us, she always believed in the potential of people and in the power and potential of ideas. So for the better part of her literary business years, Helen's definition of activism now included how she could help us unlock those ideas bouncing around in our heads, how to help otherwise smart men and women better shape those ideas, and help them share their ideas with a larger audience on a grander stage. In many ways, she used this new definition of activism to take what now looks to have been an inevitable next step in her life, in a life built on beliefs and values. Helen became a teacher. Helen, the teacher, taught us how to imagine, how to express ourselves, and how to deliver on the promise of our imagination. With her new mission also came a new perspective on objectivity and honesty. And yes, if need be, she could be brutally honest. Even though she wasn't an editor, she more often than not would say to her authors, you know, this needs a little bit more work. This needs a do-over. Well, Helen, the best do-over you ever did was David. But as I thought about all that Helen had given us during her all too short time with us, I think one of her greatest gifts may have been that she no longer felt compelled to tell us what to think, but rather she urged and incented us to think on our own. Helen ultimately lived a life where just showing up wasn't good enough. How she lived and how she loved showed us that to live a life that is good, we need to participate in this world, we need to engage with the people around, and we need not be fearful of ideas. In fact, the bigger the idea, the more likely we're to become better people because of those ideas. I think Helen cared less about whether the idea was good or bad, and more about her interest in making certain that we were not being intimidated by big ideas. So as we say goodbye to our dear Helen, let's not forget her passion, her spirit, her boundless enthusiasm, which defined how she lived. And let us never forget that she shared with us the pathway to a life full of purpose and commitment. So if grief is the price to be paid, then let me share a lyric from another not so much opera, but something called Les Miserables. Again, my apologies, Helen. To love another person is to see the face of God. Whether you believe or not, our love for Helen showed us how to be better people and live in a better world, and we will miss her. And I thank you for putting us again together to celebrate her life.
That was beautiful. Well, thank each of you for sharing your very poignant thoughts of each different piece of Helen. We loved her, and we laughed with her, and we learned from her. Thank you, Alice, for putting all of this together, and thank you, Jen, for putting all of this together. In the last year, Helen and I were talking quite often at 5 o'clock in the morning on email, and sometimes in person. And she was thinking about retirement and kind of finding her place without, running the agency, and what was a fit and what would she like to be involved with. And she said to me, I've had a big life. And she did have a big life. And we all got to shine a little bit in the light of that big life. So I thank all of you for being here. I thank all of you, some from far away, for coming and sharing your thoughts about Helen. And please join us for a reception in the foyer, and we'll have a drink to that big life. Thank you.